Welcome to Big Breaking News of America. Genesis Episode 10. Cain and Abel and the Spread of Sin, Genesis 4. The narrative of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4 is a pivotal moment in the primeval history of Genesis 1:11, marking the first instance of human violence and the deepening of sin's impact on humanity following the fall in Eden, Genesis 3. This compact yet profound story recounts the lives of Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve, their offerings to God, Cain's murder of Abel, and the subsequent divine judgment and mercy. The chapter concludes with the genealogy of Cain's descendants, their cultural achievements juxtaposed against escalating violence, and the birth of Seth as a new hope for humanity. Genesis 4 builds on the theological foundation of Genesis 1:3, illustrating the spread of sin from disobedience to fratricide, while introducing themes of moral responsibility, divine justice, and the sanctity of life that shape the Torah's ethical framework. Its literary artistry, universal themes, and engagement with ancient Near Eastern contexts make it a cornerstone of Jewish tradition and a text of global significance. This exploration examines the narrative's literary structure, theological significance, historical and cultural context, interpretive traditions, and modern relevance, highlighting its role as a critical stage in the primeval history's exploration of human nature and divine response. 1. Overview and structure of the narrative. Genesis 4 is a tightly woven narrative that unfolds in three main sections, tracing the tragic story of Cain and Abel, the consequences of their actions, and the broader implications for humanity. Spanning 26 verses, it combines vivid storytelling, poetic elements, and genealogical details to convey theological and ethical truths. Key events. Birth and offerings. Genesis 4:1-5. The narrative opens with the birth of Cain and Abel, sons of Adam and Eve. Cain, the firstborn, becomes a farmer, while Abel is a shepherd. Both offer sacrifices to God, Cain from the fruit of the ground, Abel from the firstborn of his flock. God accepts Abel's offering but not Cain's, causing Cain to become angry and his face to fall, Genesis 4:5. Murder and judgment, Genesis 4:6-16. God warns Cain to master his anger, stating, "Sin is crouching at the door, you must rule over it," Genesis 4:7. Despite this, Cain lures Abel to a field and kills him. God confronts Cain, asking, "Where is Abel your brother?" To which Cain responds, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Genesis 4:9. God curses Cain to be a wanderer, with the ground yielding no strength, but places a protective mark on him to prevent vengeance, Genesis 4:15. Cain settles in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain's descendants and Seth's birth, Genesis 4:17-26. The narrative traces Cain's lineage through his son Enoch, grandson Irad, and further descendants, noting cultural achievements like city building, music, and metallurgy, Genesis 4:17-22. Lamech, a later descendant, boasts of excessive vengeance in a poetic song, Genesis 4:23-24, signaling sin's escalation. The chapter ends with the birth of Seth to Adam and Eve, a new son to replace Abel, and the note that people began to call upon the name of the Lord, Genesis 4:25-26. Structural features. The narrative is structured as a dramatic arc, introduction of characters and conflict, Genesis 4:1-5, climax of sin and divine confrontation, Genesis 4:6-16, and resolution with consequences and new beginnings, Genesis 4:17-26. This arc mirrors the fall narrative, Genesis 3, reinforcing the theme of sin's progression. The story alternates between prose and poetic elements, with God's warning, Genesis 4:7, and Lamech's song, Genesis 4:23-24, using poetic parallelism, adding emotional and theological weight. The genealogy, Genesis 4:17-22, serves as a structural hinge, connecting the narrative to the broader primeval history. The narrative's economy, covering birth, murder, judgment, and generations in 26 verses, focuses on theological meaning, with sparse details that invite interpretation, a hallmark of Genesis's style. Literary style. The narrative is vivid and emotionally charged, with concise dialogue, for example, "Am I my brother's keeper?" that heightens tension and reveals character. The ambiguity of God's preference for Abel's offering, Genesis 4:4-5, and Cain's motives creates interpretive openness, fueling rabbinic and philosophical reflection. Imagery, such as sin crouching at the door, Genesis 4:7, and the mark of Cain, Genesis 4:15, is evocative, conveying theological truths through concrete symbols. The contrast between Cain's agricultural offering and Abel's pastoral one reflects cultural tensions, possibly between farming and herding lifestyles. The narrative's mythic quality, blending historical memory and theological truth, transcends specific contexts, making it a universal story of human conflict and divine response. Two theological themes and significance. Genesis 4 is a theological milestone in the primeval history, building on the fall, Genesis 3, to illustrate the spread of sin from disobedience to violence, while introducing themes of moral responsibility, divine justice, and mercy that shape the Torah's ethical and spiritual framework. Spread of sin. The narrative depicts sin's progression from Adam and Eve's disobedience, Genesis 3, to Cain's fratricide, the first act of human violence. Cain's anger and jealousy, unchecked despite God's warning, Genesis 4:7, illustrate the Yetzer Hara, evil inclination, a Jewish concept of the internal struggle between good and evil. The escalation of sin continues in Cain's descendants, culminating in Lamech's boast of disproportionate vengeance, Genesis 4:23-24, signaling a societal breakdown that leads to the flood, Genesis 6. This trajectory underscores sin's corrupting power, a recurring Torah theme, for example, Numbers 32:23. Cultural impact. The theme of sin's spread shapes Jewish theology of repentance, Teshuvah, central to Yom Kippur, and informs global religious and secular reflections on human imperfection and societal decay. Moral responsibility and free will. God's warning to Cain, "If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door," Genesis 4:7, affirms free will and moral responsibility. Cain's failure to rule over sin highlights the human capacity to choose, a cornerstone of Jewish ethics, for example, Deuteronomy 30:19. Cain's question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Genesis 4:9, is answered implicitly by the Torah's emphasis on communal responsibility, seen in laws like love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18. This introduces the ethical principle of accountability for others' welfare. Cultural impact. The emphasis on free will and responsibility informs Jewish practices like Mussar, ethical self-improvement, and global ethical frameworks, promoting personal and communal accountability. Divine justice and mercy. God's judgment on Cain, a curse to wander and a barren ground, Genesis 4:11-12, reflects divine justice, tying the punishment to the crime. Blood defiles the land, Genesis 4:10. This mirrors the moral causality of Genesis 3 and foreshadows the Torah's legal system, for example, Exodus 21:24. Divine mercy is evident in the protective mark, Genesis 4:15, sparing Cain from vengeance, and in allowing his lineage to thrive, Genesis 4:17-22. This balance of justice and mercy is a hallmark of Genesis's theology, seen in later covenants, for example, Genesis 9:8-17. Cultural impact. The interplay of justice and mercy influences Jewish ethics, encouraging forgiveness and compassion, and shapes religious and secular narratives of redemption, from Yom Kippur to restorative justice. Sanctity of life. The narrative establishes the sanctity of human life, with God's declaration that Abel's blood cries out from the ground, Genesis 4:10, implying inherent value. This principle underpins the Torah's prohibition of murder, Exodus 20:13, and the later Noahide law against bloodshed, Genesis 9:6. The Talmud, Sanhedrin 37a, derives from Cain's story that whoever destroys a single life destroys an entire world, a foundational Jewish ethical teaching that resonates globally. Cultural impact. The sanctity of life informs Jewish laws like Pikuach Nefesh, saving a life, and global human rights, influencing advocacy against violence and injustice. Hope amid judgment. Despite Cain's sin, the narrative ends with hope, the birth of Seth, Genesis 4:25, as a replacement for Abel, and the note that people began to call upon the name of the Lord, Genesis 4:26, suggesting renewed worship. This foreshadows the covenantal renewal in Genesis 9 and 12. The survival of Cain's line, despite its violence, reflects God's commitment to humanity, setting the stage for the Torah's redemptive arc. Cultural impact. The theme of hope amid judgment resonates in Jewish liturgy, for example, Rosh Hashanah's prayers for renewal, and global narratives of resilience, from post-exilic restoration to modern recovery efforts. 3. Literary artistry and style. The literary artistry of Genesis 4 enhances its theological impact, making it a compelling and emotionally resonant narrative. Its vivid imagery, concise dialogue, and stylistic features reflect its oral tradition roots and its role as a theological story. Narrative intensity and concision. The narrative's brevity, covering birth, murder, judgment, and generations in 26 verses, creates intensity, focusing on key moments like Cain's anger, Genesis 4:5, the murder, Genesis 4:8, and God's confrontation, Genesis 4:9-10. This economy prioritizes theological meaning over descriptive detail. The sparse narrative style, with minimal background, for example, no explanation of the offering's context, invites listeners to fill in gaps, a feature suited for oral storytelling and rabbinic exegesis. Cultural impact. The concise style ensures the narrative's memorability, making it a staple in Jewish education and global storytelling, from sermons to literature. Dialogue and dramatic tension. The use of dialogue, God's warning, Genesis 4:7, Cain's deflection, Genesis 4:9, and God's judgment, Genesis 4:10-12, heightens dramatic tension, revealing character and moral stakes. Cain's question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" is a rhetorical pivot, exposing his denial of responsibility. The absence of Abel's voice, "he speaks no words," underscores his victimhood, making his bloods cry, Genesis 4:10, a powerful symbol of injustice, engaging listeners emotionally. Cultural impact. The dialogue-driven structure influences Jewish ethical reflection, seen in Midrash exploring Cain's motives, and resonates in global narratives of conflict and accountability. Imagery and symbolism. Vivid imagery, such as sin crouching at the door, Genesis 4:7, evokes a predatory threat, symbolizing temptation's power. The mark of Cain, Genesis 4:15, is ambiguous, possibly a tattoo or sign, but symbolizes divine protection, contrasting with later misinterpretations as a curse. The blood crying from the ground, Genesis 4:10, is a potent symbol of life's sanctity, linking murder to cosmic disruption, a motif recurring in the Torah, for example, Numbers 35:33. Cultural impact. The imagery inspires artistic and literary retellings, from medieval paintings to modern novels, for example, Steinbeck's East of Eden, and shapes ethical discussions of violence and justice. Poetic and structural elements. Lamech's song, Genesis 4:23-24, with its parallel lines and boastful tone, contrasts with the prose, marking a stylistic shift that highlights sin's escalation. Its poetic form, akin to ancient Near Eastern oracles, adds gravitas to the narrative's warning about vengeance. The genealogy, Genesis 4:17-22, uses repetitive formulas, expago y, mirroring ancient Near Eastern king lists, but its inclusion of cultural achievements, music, metallurgy, juxtaposes human progress with moral decline, a narrative tension. Cultural impact. The poetic and structural elements enhance the narrative's oral appeal, ensuring its transmission in Jewish liturgy and study, and influence global literary conventions of moral storytelling. Ambiguity and interpretive openness. The narrative's ambiguities, e.g., why God rejects Cain's offering, the nature of the mark Cain's motives, invite interpretation, a hallmark of Genesis's style. This openness fuels rabbinic debate, for example, Bereshit Rabbah, and philosophical reflection on jealousy, choice, and divine fairness. The mythic quality, blending historical memory and theological truth, makes the narrative universal, addressing timeless questions of human conflict and morality. Cultural impact. The ambiguity fosters ongoing engagement, seen in Jewish Chevruta study and global discussions of ethics, psychology, and justice. 4. Historical and cultural context. Genesis 4 must be understood within its historical and cultural context, as it emerged in a world of ancient Near Eastern traditions and was likely shaped by the needs of ancient Israel, particularly during or after the Babylonian exile. Its engagement with neighboring myths and its exilic resonance reflect its purpose as a theological and cultural statement. Ancient Near Eastern parallels. The narrative engages Mesopotamian myths like the Dumuzi and Enkidu story, where two figures, a shepherd and a farmer, compete for divine favor, paralleling Cain and Abel's offerings. Genesis 4 reworks this to emphasize moral choice and divine justice, not divine rivalry, reflecting Israel's monotheism. The theme of sibling rivalry is common in ancient Near Eastern literature, for example, the Sumerian Inanna and Dumuzi, but Genesis 4's focus on fratricide and its consequences introduces a moral dimension, distinguishing it from mythological conflicts. The blood crying from the ground, Genesis 4:10, echoes Mesopotamian beliefs in blood's ritual power, but Genesis ties it to ethical violation, aligning with Israel's theology of life's sanctity. Cultural significance. By adapting familiar motifs, Genesis 4 made its theology accessible to an audience steeped in ancient Near Eastern culture, while its monotheistic focus distinguished Israel's faith, shaping its identity in a polytheistic world. Babylonian exile and Yahwist context. Scholars often attribute Genesis 4 to the Yahwist source, characterized by its narrative style and anthropomorphic portrayal of God, possibly composed during the monarchic period, c. 1587 BCE, but finalized during or after the Babylonian exile, 587–539 BCE. The exilic context shaped the narrative's focus on wandering, Genesis 4:12, mirroring Israel's displacement, and hope through Seth, Genesis 4:25, reflecting restoration aspirations. The theme of divine mercy, for example, the mark, Genesis 4:15, countered Babylonian claims of divine supremacy, affirming Israel's God as just and compassionate, critical for exilic identity. The narrative's universal scope, addressing humanity's moral failure, resonated with the diverse Babylonian Empire, positioning Israel within a global divine plan. Cultural significance. The exilic shaping made Genesis 4 a text of resilience, unifying Jews through a shared story of human struggle and divine faithfulness, vital in diaspora. Oral tradition roots. The narrative's vivid imagery, dialogue, and poetic elements suggest origins in oral tradition, likely recited in tribal or cultic settings before its written form. The story's dramatic structure and memorable motifs, for example, the Blood's Cry, Lamech's song, aided memorization, ensuring its transmission. The transition to written form, possibly during the monarchic or exilic period, preserved the narrative for communal study and worship, aligning with scribal practices in ancient Israel. Cultural impact. The oral-to-written development made Genesis 4 adaptable, from ancient storytelling to synagogue readings, Parshiyo, ensuring its endurance in Jewish culture. Socio-political dynamics. The narrative's emphasis on the sanctity of life and moral responsibility challenged ancient Near Eastern practices, such as blood feuds, reflecting Israel's ethical distinctiveness, for example, Exodus 21:12–14. The relational portrayal of God supported Israel's identity as a covenantal people, distinct from neighboring cultures. The wandering motif addressed exilic questions of displacement and divine presence, affirming God's care despite judgment, a concern in the face of Babylonian domination. Cultural impact. These dynamics shaped Jewish theology and ethics, influencing the Torah's laws and prophetic calls for justice, and resonating in modern discussions of human rights and communal responsibility. 5. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations. The richness of Genesis 4 has inspired extensive Jewish interpretive traditions, from rabbinic exegesis to mystical theology, deepening its theological and cultural significance and ensuring its relevance across generations. Rabbinic exegesis. Bereshit Rabbah, c. 5th century CE, interprets Cain's sin as a failure to master the Yetzer Hara, with God's warning, Genesis 4:7, urging self-control. The Midrash suggests Cain's offering was inferior in intent, not substance, emphasizing sincerity in worship, Genesis Rabbah 22:5. The protective mark, Genesis 4:15, is seen as a sign of God's compassion, encouraging Teshuvah. Rashi, 11th century, views it as a physical sign, for example, a letter of God's name, while Ramban, 13th century, sees it as a divine decree, teaching mercy. The Talmud, Sanhedrin 37a, derives the sanctity of life from Abel's blood, stating that whoever destroys a single life destroys an entire world, a principle shaping Jewish ethics and law. Cultural impact. Rabbinic interpretations shape Jewish liturgy, for example, Yom Kippur's focus on repentance, education, for example, Torah study of Bereshit, and ethics, for example, Pikuach Nefesh, making the narrative a living text in communal life. Mystical perspectives. The Zohar, 13th century, views Genesis 4 as a spiritual drama, with Cain and Abel representing the Sefirot of Gevurah, judgment, and chaste, loving kindness. Cain's failure to balance these forces leads to imbalance, symbolized by the murder, while Seth restores harmony. The mark of Cain is interpreted as a spiritual sign, protecting the soul through divine light, and the blood's cry, Genesis 4:10, is seen as a cosmic disruption, requiring tikkun, repair. Lamech's song reflects the Sitra Achra, other side, the realm of impurity. Cultural impact. Mystical readings enrich Jewish spirituality, influencing prayer, for example, meditations on repentance, meditation, and festivals, appealing to those seeking deeper meaning in Genesis 4. Ethical and communal applications. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations inspire Jewish ethics, with Cain's story cited in Musar literature to promote self-control, forgiveness, and communal responsibility. The sanctity of life underpins advocacy for peace and justice. The narrative's universal themes encourage outreach, with Jewish thinkers like Maimonides citing Genesis 4 to affirm humanity's shared moral journey, influencing interfaith dialogue. Cultural impact. These interpretations ensure Genesis 4's role in Jewish communal life, from ethical teachings to social justice initiatives, reinforcing its cultural vitality. 6. Engagement with ancient Near Eastern traditions. The narrative's dialogue with ancient Near Eastern traditions is a critical aspect of its historical and cultural context, as it adapts and transforms familiar motifs to assert a monotheistic theology. Mesopotamian context. The Dumuzi and Enkidu myth, where a shepherd and farmer compete, parallels Cain and Abel's offerings, but Genesis 4's focus on moral choice and divine justice distinguishes it, reflecting Israel's ethical monotheism. The blood crying from the ground, Genesis 4:10, echoes Mesopotamian beliefs in blood's ritual significance, but Genesis ties it to ethical violation, aligning with Israel's theology of life's sanctity. Cultural significance. By engaging Mesopotamian motifs, Genesis 4 made its theology accessible while asserting Israel's distinct faith, particularly relevant in the exilic context of Babylonian influence. Egyptian parallels. Egyptian myths, such as the conflict between Osiris and Set, feature sibling rivalry, but Genesis 4's emphasis on human agency and divine response contrasts with Egypt's mythological determinism, highlighting Israel's unique anthropology. The protective mark, Genesis 4:15, may echo Egyptian amulets for divine protection, but Genesis uses it to emphasize God's mercy, not magical power. Cultural significance. These parallels ground Genesis 4 in a familiar cultural milieu, making its theology relatable while asserting Israel's worldview. Canaanite influences. Canaanite myths, such as Baal's conflicts, feature violence, but Genesis 4's portrayal of fratricide as a moral failing, not divine rivalry, aligns with Israel's rejection of polytheism. The genealogy's cultural achievements, Genesis 4:2022, may reflect Canaanite urban advancements, but their link to violence critiques societal pride. Cultural significance. The engagement with Canaanite motifs positioned Genesis 4 as a theological counterpoint, reinforcing Israel's monotheistic identity in its regional context. Theological innovation. Genesis 4's monotheism, focus on moral responsibility, and balance of justice and mercy distinguish it from ancient Near Eastern myths, offering a vision of humanity as accountable to a single God. Its universal scope, addressing all humanity's moral failure, contrasts with tribal myths, reflecting Israel's covenantal mission, Genesis 12:3. Cultural impact. This innovation influenced Western religious and ethical traditions, from the Torah's laws to human rights principles, ensuring Genesis 4's global legacy. 7. Enduring relevance and modern applications. Genesis 4 remains a living text, its themes and lessons resonating in Jewish practice, interfaith dialogue, and contemporary issues. Its adaptability ensures its significance in addressing modern challenges while rooted in ancient wisdom. Jewish practice and identity. The narrative is central to Jewish liturgy and study, with Parsha Bereshit, Genesis 1:16-8, opening the Torah cycle, engaging communities through synagogue readings and discussion. Cain's story informs Yom Kippur's focus on Teshuvah, illustrating the power of repentance. The sanctity of life shapes Jewish ethics, seen in Pikuach Nefesh and advocacy for peace, while the theme of communal responsibility influences synagogue programs and tzedakah. The wandering motif resonates in Jewish history, from the Babylonian exile to modern diaspora, inspiring resilience, reflected in prayers for redemption. Interfaith and universal resonance. In Christianity, Genesis 4 shapes reflections on sin and redemption, with Cain's story illustrating human frailty and divine grace, read in Lent and ethical teachings. The sanctity of life influences Christian ethics, from anti-violence advocacy to charity. In Islam, the Quran's retelling of Cain and Abel, Surah Al-Ma'idah 5:27-32, emphasizes the sanctity of life and moral accountability, fostering shared Abrahamic values. Interfaith initiatives draw on Genesis 4 to address issues like conflict resolution and human dignity. The narrative's universal themes, jealousy, responsibility, hope, provide common ground for ethical discussions, from personal accountability to societal justice, in interfaith and secular contexts. Contemporary issues. Ethics and conflict resolution. Cain's jealousy and violence inform discussions of interpersonal conflict, with Jewish and global thinkers citing Genesis 4 to promote forgiveness and mediation, addressing issues like family disputes and workplace tensions. Sanctity of life. The narrative's emphasis on life's value underpins advocacy against violence, from gun control to war prevention, resonating with Jewish and global human rights movements. Psychological and social insights. Cain's anger and denial resonate in psychology, informing therapies for managing emotions, and in sociology, addressing systemic issues like envy-driven inequality. Environmental ethics. The curse on the ground. Genesis 4:11-12, inspires Jewish environmental movements, with organizations like Hazen linking Cain's sin to ecological harm, advocating for sustainability. Cultural and educational role. Genesis 4 inspires literature, for example, Steinbeck's East of Eden, art, for example, William Blake's The Body of Abel found by Adam and Eve, and media, for example, the Bible series, shaping cultural narratives of conflict and redemption. Its archetypal imagery, blood, the mark, resonates in storytelling across genres. In education, Genesis 4 is studied in Jewish day schools, yeshivas, and universities, fostering discussions of theology, ethics, and psychology. Its accessibility engages diverse audiences, from children learning about Cain and Abel to scholars analyzing its symbolism. 8. Broader cultural and religious impact. The narrative's impact extends beyond Judaism, shaping religious traditions, cultural narratives, and ethical thought worldwide. Jewish tradition. Genesis 4 is foundational to Jewish theology, liturgy, and ethics, influencing practices like Teshuvah, Pikuach Nefesh, and communal study. Its narratives are retold in synagogue readings, education, and festivals, ensuring its vitality in communal life. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations deepen its significance, from Bereshit Rabbah's ethical insights to the Zohar's spiritual vision, enriching Jewish thought and practice. Interfaith influence. In Christianity, Genesis 4 shapes reflections on sin, redemption, and the sanctity of life, influencing theology, liturgy, and ethics. Its narratives impact Western religious culture, seen in art and literature. In Islam, the Quran's Cain and Abel story reflects Genesis 4's themes, fostering shared Abrahamic values. Interfaith initiatives draw on the narrative to address ethical and social issues, from peace building to human dignity. Global culture. Genesis 4's themes inspire literature, art, and media, from medieval manuscripts to modern films, shaping cultural narratives of human struggle and hope. Its archetypal imagery ensures its presence in storytelling, from myths to novels. The narrative's ethical contributions, particularly moral responsibility and the sanctity of life, inform global human rights, psychological insights, and philosophical debates, reflecting its enduring legacy. 9. Synthesis. Genesis 4 as a theological and ethical milestone. Genesis 4, the story of Cain and Abel and the spread of sin, is a theological and ethical milestone in the primeval history, illustrating the progression of sin from disobedience to violence while affirming human responsibility, divine justice, and mercy. Its literary artistry, vivid imagery, concise dialogue, poetic elements, and ambiguity, enhances its emotional and theological impact, making it a timeless narrative of human conflict and divine response. Rooted in the ancient Near Eastern milieu, it engages Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Canaanite motifs to assert a monotheistic vision of moral accountability, shaped by the exilic context to inspire hope and identity. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations deepen its meaning, ensuring its vitality in Jewish tradition, while its universal themes resonate in interfaith and secular contexts. In modern times, Genesis 4 addresses contemporary issues like ethics, violence, psychology, and environmental care, affirming its relevance as a source of wisdom and inspiration. As a critical stage in the primeval history, it sets the stage for the Torah's exploration of sin, judgment, and redemption, offering a vision of humanity's struggle and God's enduring commitment. Thank you for watching Big Breaking News of America. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon for more news updates. Share our channel with your friends and family members. Leave a like for more videos and express your thoughts under comment section.